my daughter-in-law, made my father kneel and polish her shoes, but she didn't know he owned the hospital. Sunday dinner at our penthouse overlooking Central Park was always stuffy. The atmosphere was luxurious, the wine expensive, the conversation awkward. My father, Arthur, was recounting the story of the hospital's difficult early days, the snowstorm and how they had to take turns manually squeezing a ventilator to save a patient. My wife, Chloe, looked up from her phone, scrolling through the new Chanel collection. Lovely story, Dad. She turned to me, her voice full of excitement. Honey, have you seen the Vanderbilts put their Hamptons mansion up for sale? The Pendletons need a proper summer home, don't they? Then, with a wave of her hand toward my father, she added, Not that shack your father has in the suburbs. My fork fell from my hand. My father quietly put down his knife and fork, his eyes flickering. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you? And where are you listening? The light from the plaza's grand chandelier, a galaxy of crystal and gold, didn't just illuminate the ballroom, it performed. It danced across the sequins of a congresswoman's gown, glinted off the rim of a hedge fund manager's champagne flute, and ignited the diamond necklace circling his wife's throat. From his position near the towering floral arrangement, Dr. Wesley Thorne watched that light find Chloe. Of course it did. Light always found Chloe. He felt a familiar surge of pride, warm and expansive in his chest. This was his life. A successful cardiology practice, a board seat at Pendleton Memorial, a beautiful wife who charmed every room she entered. Tonight, she was particularly radiant in a silvery, whisper-thin dress that probably cost more than his first car. She was holding court with the hospital's chief administrator and his wife, her laughter tinkling above the sophisticated hum of the orchestra. It was perfect, a perfect, polished, well-earned life. She's a marvel, isn't she? Wesley turned. His father, Arthur, stood beside him, a quiet island in the glittering sea of New York's elite. He wore his one good suit, a dark wool number that was at least a decade old but still impeccably tailored. A retired history teacher from Queens, Arthur observed the spectacle with a detached amusement, like a visiting scholar studying a foreign tribe. She really is, Wesley agreed, his gaze drifting back to Chloe. He noticed the way she tilted her head, the way her smile reached her eyes, and felt that proprietary thrill again. That's my wife. But as he watched, she shifted her attention to Arthur, raising a hand in a delicate wave. Arthur nodded back, his expression unreadable. Wesley felt a faint, unnamed ripple of discomfort. It wasn't anything Chloe did. It was just the juxtaposition. The sheer, effortless expense of Chloe against the quiet, steadfast frugality of his father. He'd never noticed it so acutely before. He pushed the thought away, blaming it on the 2 glasses of champagne. He was about to rejoin his wife when the moment happened. A young waiter, no older than 20, was navigating the treacherous terrain between tables, his tray laden with wine glasses. He had the earnest, slightly panicked look of a student earning his tuition. As he squeezed past Chloe's circle, his elbow caught the edge of a velvet-draped chair. It was a tiny miscalculation, a fractional error, but it was enough. A glass of deep red Merlot tilted, wobbled, and cascaded down the front of Chloe's silver dress. A crimson stain bloomed against the shimmering fabric, a shocking wound on a flawless canvas. The boy froze, his face draining of all color. "Oh my God, ma'am, I am so sorry," he stammered, his hands fluttering uselessly with a cocktail napkin. The conversations around them paused, heads turning. Wesley started forward, a placating smile already forming on his lips. It was just an accident. He'd say something reassuring, smooth it over, maybe even slip the kid $100 bill for his trouble. But Chloe was faster. She didn't scream or cause a scene. That wasn't her style. Instead, a serene, icy smile settled on her lips. It was a terrifyingly calm expression. She placed a gentle hand on the boy's arm, stopping his frantic dabbing, and leaned in close, as if sharing a secret. Wesley was only a few feet away, close enough to hear the soft, venomous whisper that slithered from her perfectly glossed lips. "Do you have any idea how much this dress costs?" she murmured, her voice a silken threat. It's more than your entire college tuition. Get out of my sight before I have you fired, and make sure you never work in this city again." The words hit Wesley like a physical blow. He stopped dead. The blood roared in his ears, momentarily drowning out the orchestra. The air seemed to thin, the glittering scene warping at the edges. That's not Chloe. The thought was a desperate shield. She's just nervous. That dress must have been expensive. She's under pressure. He scrambled for an excuse, any rationalization to stitch this horrifying moment back into the seamless fabric of his perfect life. The waiter, white as a sheet, simply nodded, turned and disappeared into the crowd, his shoulders hunched in defeat. And then Chloe turned back to Wesley and the others, her face a mask of dazzling composure. "Oh, goodness, what a clumsy boy," she said with a light, airy laugh, dabbing at the stain with her own napkin. "It's nothing, really. Thank heavens for good dry cleaners." The chief administrator chuckled, relieved. "A true class act, Chloe. Most people would have had a fit." Wesley felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He met his father's eyes across the small space. Arthur's face was still, his gaze fixed on Chloe, and in their depths Wesley saw not surprise, but a quiet, sad affirmation. It was as if his father was seeing something he had already known was there. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Wesley. He smiled, he shook hands, he donated another $5,000 at the auction. But the image of Chloe's face, the sound of her whisper, played on a loop in his mind. It wasn't a public outburst. It was a private act of cruelty, delivered with surgical precision, which made it infinitely more chilling. It begged the question, who was the woman he had married? Later, in the silent, leather-scented interior of the Uber Black, gliding through the canyons of Manhattan, the seed of doubt, once planted, began to sprout. Chloe was beside him, bathed in the glow of her phone, happily scrolling through photos from the gala tagged on Instagram. She hummed a little tune from the orchestra, completely untroubled. Wesley stared out the window, watching the monolithic skyscrapers pass by, their brilliant lights feeling distant and cold. For the first time in their 7 years together, sitting right next to the woman he loved, he felt an immeasurable distance. He replayed the scene again, but this time he saw it through his father's eyes. He began to wonder. Had his father, the silent observer, seen this before? Had he seen other cracks in the perfect facade? Wesley started to think about the way Chloe sometimes spoke to the doorman, the subtle impatience in her voice with a slow nurse on the phone, the dismissive tone she used when talking about her own father. Little things he'd never truly registered, moments he had brushed aside. Now they were gathering in his mind, forming a constellation of unease. More cracks were beginning to appear, and he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he would never be able to stop looking for them. The week after the gala was a quiet torment. The memory of Chloe's whisper followed Wesley like a shadow, clinging to the edges of his consciousness. He found himself watching her, searching for other cracks. But she was, as always, flawless. She was the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, the perfect partner to a successful doctor. And yet, the doubt remained, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their perfect life. On Sunday, the hum grew louder. Sundays were for his father. It was a tradition Wesley had insisted upon when he and Chloe married. Every Sunday, Arthur would take the F train from Queens to their Park Avenue penthouse for dinner. As Wesley poured his father a glass of Cabernet, a bottle Chloe had selected, which cost more than Arthur's weekly grocery bill, his mind drifted back. He remembered being a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, following his father through the cavernous, echoing basement of Pendleton Memorial on a Saturday. A pipe had burst, flooding a storage room, and the weekend maintenance crew was short-staffed. Wesley remembered the smell of damp concrete and antiseptic. He remembered watching his father, the hospital's founder and director, a man whose name was carved in granite above the main entrance, roll up the sleeves of his dress shirt, pick up a heavy pipe wrench, and wade into the ankle-deep water to fix the leak himself. "Someone has to do it," Arthur had said with a simple shrug when the head of maintenance arrived, flustered and apologetic. "A hospital doesn't stop just because it's the weekend, son. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty." Wesley had looked at his father's hands, strong, capable, smudged with grease, and felt a swell of awe. This was the man who built it all, not with money he had inherited, but with grit, with sacrifice, with a profound sense of duty. A sharp, digital chime pulled him back to the present. The contrast was dizzying. He was standing in a living room that looked like a page from Architectural Digest, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a breathtaking jewel-box view of the city. His father sat on a minimalist Italian sofa that was probably more art than furniture, looking sturdy and out of place, a solid oak tree in a sterile gallery. And across from them, curled in a plush armchair, was Chloe, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. Dinner was served at the long glass table overlooking Central Park. The conversation was stilted, a dance of polite inquiries and carefully curated anecdotes. It was during the main course that Arthur, perhaps feeling a pang of nostalgia himself, began to tell a story about the hospital's early days. "You know," he began, his eyes distant with memory, "in that first year we almost didn't make it. We were running on fumes, a skeleton crew of doctors and nurses who believed in what we were doing. I remember one night, a blizzard hit, knocked the power out for 6 city blocks. The backup generators failed. We had a man on a ventilator, and for 8 hours, 3 of us took turns bagging him by hand until the power came back on. 8 hours. He shook his head, a small, proud smile on his face. We saved him. That's what it was all about." Wesley felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. These were the stories he'd grown up on, the foundational myths of his life. These were stories of substance, of meaning. Chloe, who had been scrolling through the Chanel website, looked up, her expression placid. "That's a lovely story, Arthur," she said, her tone light, dismissive, as if he'd just recounted a mildly amusing anecdote about the weather. She turned her bright, focused gaze on Wesley. "Darling, did you see that the Vanderbilts just listed their Hamptons estate? We should have a look. The Pendleton name needs a proper summer home, don't you think?" She gestured vaguely in Arthur's direction. "Not just that. Cabin your father has upstate." The word hung in the air, small and sharp, and devastatingly cruel. Cabin. He'd called it a cabin. Arthur's house in the Catskills, the house he'd built with his own 2 hands over 3 summers, the house where Wesley had spent every August of his childhood, the house that held the sum of his father's quiet, unassuming legacy. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a home, filled with books and memories and the smell of pine. Wesley's fork clattered against his plate. He looked at his father. Arthur's face didn't change, but a light in his eyes went out. He placed his knife and fork neatly together, his appetite gone. The silence that followed was thick with everything Wesley had left unsaid. He wanted to scream at her. He wanted to defend his father, but he didn't. He sat there, paralyzed, a traitor in his own home. The drive back to Queens was the worst part. The silence in the car was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. The familiar streets, the brick apartment buildings, the glow of the corner bodegas, it all felt like a world he had abandoned. As he pulled up to his father's building, the same modest, rent-controlled apartment he'd lived in for 40 years, Arthur finally spoke. "It was a nice dinner, son," he said, his voice even. He placed a hand on Wesley's shoulder. "She's ambitious, your wife. Just be careful she remembers what's important." It wasn't a condemnation. It was a warning, born of love, and it was infinitely more painful. Wesley watched his father walk into the building until the door closed behind him. He felt a profound, hollowing guilt. He hadn't just failed to protect his father. He had been a silent accomplice to the insult. What kind of man had he become? He had been so seduced by the glittering world Chloe had built around them that he'd forgotten the foundation upon which he was raised. Driving back over the Queensboro Bridge, the magnificent Manhattan skyline spread out before him, he made a decision. He needed to reconnect with his father's legacy, with the real meaning of the Pendleton name. He would start spending more time at the hospital, walking the halls his father had built, remembering where he came from. He thought it was a way to find himself again. He had no idea it was the path that would lead him to a truth far more horrifying than a cruel whisper at a party or a dismissive comment at dinner. He was looking for cracks, but he was about to find a chasm. The guilt from Sunday dinner was a stone in Wesley's gut. All through a grueling 8-hour aortic valve replacement on Tuesday, it sat there, heavy and undigested. As he stripped off his scrubs, the exhaustion felt deeper than physical. He needed to talk to his father. Not to apologize, exactly Arthur wouldn't want that, but to somehow close the chasm that had opened in that silent car ride back to Queens. He went to his father's office first. It was more of a small, cluttered study than a corporate suite, tucked away in the hospital's original wing. It was empty. A half-finished crossword puzzle sat on the desk, a silent testament to its owner's unpretentious habits. Wesley checked the boardroom, the doctor's lounge, even the cafeteria. Nothing. Feeling a strange sense of unease, he started back toward his own office, taking a shortcut through the West Wing's outpatient corridor. It was late afternoon, and the hallway was deserted, already bathed in the long, melancholic shadows of the setting Sunday. The air smelled of disinfectant and floor wax. And then he saw him. At the far end of the hall, a janitor was methodically mopping the linoleum floor. He was a man of Arthur's generation, dressed in standard-issue gray work clothes, his back to Wesley. Wesley was about to walk past, lost in his own thoughts, when something made him stop. It was the man's posture, the economy of his movements. There was a quiet deliberateness to the way he handled the mop, a sense of purpose that seemed to go beyond the task itself. It wasn't the shuffling, weary gait of someone counting the minutes until quitting time. It was proprietary. Wesley's heart began to beat a little faster. He took a few steps closer. The janitor wore a simple gray baseball cap, pulled down low. But Wesley could see the familiar slope of his shoulders, the set of his neck. He saw the man's hands as he wrung out the mop strong, capable hands that had once shown a small boy how to fix a leaking pipe. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was his father. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Wesley felt a wave of dizzying confusion, followed by a hot flush of something he couldn't name. He crept closer, his expensive leather-soled shoes silent on the damp floor. "Dad?" he whispered, the word feeling foreign and ridiculous in his mouth. The man stopped mopping. He turned around slowly, and his eyes, the same clear, observant eyes that had watched Wesley grow up, met his. Arthur Pendleton, founder of the hospital, a man whose net worth was a matter of public record, stood before his son, holding a mop and wearing a janitor's uniform. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look embarrassed. He simply looked at Wesley with a calm, steady gaze. "You're done early," Arthur said, his voice quiet. What are you doing?" Wesley stammered, his mind struggling to process the scene. "I don't understand." Arthur leaned the mop against the wall and wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "A captain needs to know every corner of his ship, son, not just the bridge." He gave a small, wry smile. "You'd be amazed what you learn when people think you're invisible. You learn which nurses are overworked, which equipment is failing, which doctors are kind to the cleaning staff." He nodded down the hall. "Frank, over in security, keeps a uniform for me. I come in once a month or so, unannounced, just to check on the health of the place." Wesley stared at him, a tidal wave of emotion rising in his throat. Shock, disbelief, and then a profound, aching admiration that eclipsed everything else. He thought of Chloe's ambition, of their penthouse, of the talk of Hampton's estates. He had been so proud of his wealth, of his status. And here was his father, a man who could buy and sell him 100 times over, finding value and dignity in a mop bucket. The shame Wesley felt was sharp and cleansing. Shame that he had ever, for a single second, been embarrassed by this man's simplicity. This wasn't simplicity, this was strength. Before he could find the words to respond, the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of high heels echoed from the far end of the corridor. Both men turned. It was Chloe, a vision in a cream-colored Burberry trench coat, her phone pressed to her ear. She was coming to meet him for dinner. Wesley's blood ran cold. He had a frantic, fleeting impulse to hide his father, to shove him into a closet, and the thought shamed him to his core. Chloe didn't even glance at the janitor as she approached, her focus entirely on her phone call. Her voice, crisp and clear in the empty hallway, carried easily. "I know, can you believe it?" she said, a note of theatrical exasperation in her tone. "He actually thinks that old cabin is heritage. It's embarrassing, Tiffany. I'm telling you, sometimes dealing with the self-made crowd is utterly exhausting." She swept past Arthur, so close that her coat brushed against his gray work pants. She offered Wesley a bright air kiss of a smile, oblivious, before continuing down the hall, her voice fading as she turned a corner. Wesley stood frozen, his gaze locked on his father. Arthur hadn't flinched. His expression remained placid, his eyes betraying nothing. He just stood there, a silent, invisible man in a gray uniform, having just heard his life's work, his very essence, dismissed as an embarrassment by the woman his son had married. A time bomb had been planted in the foundation of Wesley's life. He knew it. And as he looked at his father, who simply picked up his mop and went back to work, Wesley had the terrifying realization that he was the only one who could hear it ticking. From the second-floor glass balcony overlooking the main lobby, Wesley felt a rare moment of peace. The afternoon sun streamed through the three-story atrium windows of Pendleton Memorial, casting long, golden rectangles across the polished marble floor. He was leaning against the railing, discussing a complex case with his colleague, Dr. Mark Evans, the hospital's chief of neurosurgery. Below them, the lobby hummed with its usual controlled chaos. The gentle chime of the elevators, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the murmur of conversations. It was the rhythm of the world his father had built. And then the storm arrived. He saw her before he heard her. Chloe pushed through the main revolving doors with such force that they spun wildly in her wake. Her face, usually a carefully composed mask of pleasantness, was a thundercloud of fury. She marched across the lobby, her red-soled Christian Louboutin heels clicking against the marble like tiny, furious gunshots. "Good God, Wes," Mark said, following his gaze. "Is that your wife? She looks like she's about to declare war." Wesley felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen this anger before, but it was always in private, a flash of irritation over a delayed reservation, a cold fury at a perceived slight from a friend. He'd never seen it unleashed in public. At that moment, his father was making his way across the lobby, pushing a yellow bucket on wheels. He was in his gray janitor's uniform, moving with that same quiet purpose Wesley now understood. He was heading for a small spill near the information desk. His path and Chloe's were about to intersect. "No," Wesley whispered, a prayer to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. It was as if the universe had a sick sense of humor. Chloe, incandescent with a rage Wesley couldn't begin to fathom, wasn't looking where she was going. She caught her foot on the edge of the bucket. It wasn't a hard trip, just enough to make her stumble. The bucket tipped, and a wave of murky gray water sloshed over the side, splashing directly onto her pristine, bone-white designer shoes. The lobby's hum died. A sudden, vacuum-sealed silence fell over the dozens of people scattered across the vast space. A young nurse behind the check-in counter froze, her hand hovering over her keyboard. An elderly man in a wheelchair slowly turned his head. Everyone was watching. Chloe looked down at her shoe, at the dirty water staining the perfect white leather. She looked up at the old man in the gray uniform who stood before her holding a mop, and the dam of her fury broke. "Look what you've done!" she shrieked, her voice echoing unnaturally in the cavernous hall. The sound was sharp, brittle, utterly devoid of her usual charm. "You clumsy old man! These are Louboutins! Do you even know what that means?" From his vantage point, Wesley watched his father's face. It remained calm, a small island of stillness, in the hurricane of Chloe's rage. Arthur looked at her, then at the shoe, and his voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. Let me get a cloth." "Oh?" Chloe let out a sound that was half laugh, half sneer. It was a sound of pure contempt. "A cloth? No, that won't do." She took a step closer to him, her voice dropping into a low, menacing register, yet loud enough for everyone in the silent lobby to hear every single venomous word. "You will get on your knees, and you will polish this stain off with your own hands, now, in front of everyone, so you learn your place." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Mark Evans beside Wesley swore under his breath. "This is insane," he muttered. "Someone should stop her." But Wesley couldn't move. He was frozen, pinned to the spot by a horrifying cocktail of shock, rage, and a profound, soul-crushing humiliation on his father's behalf. He was watching a public execution, and the victim was the man he admired most in the world. He saw people pulling out their phones, the small red lights of recording buttons winking on one by one. Down below, Arthur looked at Chloe. He didn't argue, he didn't plead. He simply held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that was more regal than any act of defiance, he leaned his mop against the bucket. He placed one hand on his knee, and he began to lower himself to the floor. The sound of his knee joint popping was a small, sharp crack that seemed to ricochet off the marble. And in that instant, watching his father, the founder, the builder, the man of quiet dignity, kneel before his shrieking, tyrannical wife, something inside Wesley died. It wasn't a crack this time. It was a seismic fracture. The love he thought he had for Chloe, the life he thought they'd built, the future he'd imagined, it all crumbled into dust. It was a sham, a hideous, glittering sham. What remained in its place was cold, clear, and as hard as diamond. He finally turned away from the railing, his face a pale, unreadable mask. "I have to go," he said to Mark, his voice a dead monotone. He didn't wait for a reply. He walked away, not down to the lobby to intervene, but back toward the quiet, forgotten corridors of the hospital's old wing. The explosion had happened. The damage was done. Now, it was time to find the notebook. It was time to find his father's ledger, the one he knew he kept, the janitor's notebook. And with it, he would begin to plan. Wesley walked through the hospital corridors like a ghost, blind to the concerned glances from nurses and the questioning looks from his colleagues. The scene from the lobby was seared onto the back of his eyelids. His father's slow, deliberate descent, the vicious triumph on Chloe's face, the damning red lights of a dozen recording phones. He wasn't walking to his father's office to offer comfort. He was a man running to the scene of a crime, choking on a toxic mix of rage and suffocating guilt. He pushed open the heavy oak door without knocking. He expected to find his father slumped in his chair, a man hollowed out by humiliation. He was prepared for tears, for anger, for the raw, messy aftermath of what had just happened. He was not prepared for the quiet. Arthur's office was a time capsule. There were no flat-screen monitors or sleek chrome furniture. The walls were covered in framed blueprints of the hospital's various wings. The original architectural drawings yellowed with age. A scale model of the main building sat on a wide credenza, and the air smelled of old paper, pipe, tobacco, and something fundamentally solid like the earth itself. It was the office of a builder, an engineer, a man who dealt in foundations. Arthur was sitting at his large, cluttered desk. He wasn't crying. He wasn't raging. He was perfectly, unnervingly calm. In his hands he held a thick, leather-bound notebook, its cover worn smooth with years of use. He was turning the pages slowly, his expression as serene as if he were reading a familiar novel. "Dad, Wesley's voice cracked. The apology, the fury, it all died in his throat. "I am so sorry. I froze. I should have—" Arthur looked up, his eyes clear and steady. There was no pain in them. There was no shame. There was only a chilling, absolute clarity. He raised a hand, silencing Wesley. "It was always going to happen, son," he said, his voice even. "Something like this. The specific details don't matter. It was inevitable." He turned the ledger around on his desk so Wesley could see it. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook, its pages filled with his father's neat architectural script. Wesley saw entries dating back decades, notes on construction costs, observations on staff performance, details of equipment purchases. It was the secret history of Pendleton Memorial. Arthur flipped back several pages, his finger tracing a line until he found what he was looking for. He tapped the page. Wesley leaned in. The entry was dated 7 years ago, just a few weeks after his wedding to Chloe. There were only 6 words. Chloe Vance Thorne. Asset or liability. Observe. The breath left Wesley's body in a rush. He stared at the words, at the cool, dispassionate assessment written by a man who had seen right through the glittering facade from the very beginning. His father hadn't just been a quiet, disapproving father-in-law. He had been an analyst, a pragmatist, waiting for the data to come in. "In business and in life, son, you have to know the difference," Arthur said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "Some things look shiny on the outside, but they will bankrupt you from within. I've been observing." He slowly closed the book, the sound of the thick leather cover shutting echoing in the quiet room like a judge's gavel. "The ledger is now complete." This was not a victim. This was a chess master who had just watched his opponent make a fatal, predictable move. "I had hoped I was wrong," Arthur continued, steepling his fingers. "For your sake, I gave her every chance to prove she was an asset, but a person's character is like a foundation. If it's weak, it doesn't matter how beautiful the building is. Eventually it will collapse." "Oh." He looked directly at Wesley, and for the first time Wesley saw the steel beneath the quiet exterior. "This is no longer a family matter. It's a business one. She is a liability to this family and to the name of this hospital. And liabilities, he said, the words precise and cold, must be cut. He began to outline the plan. It wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a strategy, one that Wesley realized had been sitting in reserve, a contingency for the catastrophe he had just witnessed. It involved the hospital's board of directors, of which Chloe was a nominal, decorative member. It involved her chairmanship of 3 high-profile hospital charities, positions entirely dependent on her marriage and the Pendleton name. Most importantly, it involved a little-known morality clause in their prenuptial agreement, a clause Arthur's own lawyer had insisted upon that was triggered by public behavior that brought disrepute upon the family. Franken Security has already secured the lobby's CCTV footage, Arthur said, along with the names of a half-dozen employees who will serve as witnesses. The videos circulating on social media will be more than sufficient for the public relations aspect of this. Wesley felt a profound, almost dizzying sense of relief wash over him. The conflict that had been tearing him apart, his loyalty to his wife versus the truth he was beginning to see, was over. The path was clear. He no longer had to protect Chloe. He had to protect his father. He had to protect his family's name, a name that stood for service and dignity, not cruelty and entitlement. He stood up straighter, the guilt and helplessness replaced by a cold, hard resolve that mirrored his father's. The son of the builder had found his own foundation again. He looked at the man who had knelt on a dirty floor to expose a rot that he, Wesley, had allowed to fester in their lives. "What do you need me to do, Dad?" Wesley asked. Arthur gave a slight, grim nod. The plan was in motion. An extraordinary board meeting would be called for the following morning. The lawyers were already being briefed. The beautiful, glittering world he had shared with Chloe was about to be systematically and publicly dismantled. The summons arrived the next morning, not as a phone call, but as a formal, cream-colored envelope delivered by courier. It was addressed solely to Mrs. Chloe Thorne. Inside, the letterhead was from the prestigious law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, representing the board of directors of Pendleton Memorial Hospital. It requested her presence at an extraordinary board meeting to be held that afternoon at 3 o'clock sharp. The stated purpose was vague, official, and utterly intoxicating to Chloe, to discuss future fundraising and governance initiatives. She read it 3 times, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across her face. This was it. This was recognition. The incident with the clumsy janitor must have shaken them up. They realized they needed a firmer hand, a modern perspective. Her perspective, she immediately called Tiffany. "They're finally seeing sense," she said, pacing the length of their penthouse living room, the letter held aloft like a trophy. "Arthur is a sweet old man, but he's ancient. This hospital needs to be a brand, a luxury experience, like the Mayo Clinic, but with better art. They need me." Oh, her confidence was a fortress, impenetrable and absolute. She spent the rest of the day in a flurry of pleasant activity. A manicure, a call with a personal shopper to reserve a new Tom Ford power dress, a celebratory glass of champagne at lunch. She was so absorbed in her own ascent that she barely registered Wesley's absence. He came home just after sunset, finding her in their cavernous walk-in closet, admiring her reflection in the full-length mirror. She had chosen the Tom Ford dress a sheath of razor-sharp black, tailoring that screamed authority. "There you are," she said, turning to him. "Big day tomorrow. Well, today, I suppose." Wesley's face was a mask of exhaustion. He loosened his tie, his movements stiff. "Hello, Chloe." The coldness in his voice, the way he didn't meet her eye, finally pierced her bubble of self-congratulation. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. "Wesley, what's wrong?" she asked, her tone shifting from triumphant to petulant. "You've been so distant. Is it about that janitor?" "Don't worry, darling." She glided toward him, wrapping her arms around his neck, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial purr. "I'll speak to your father about improving the staff training process. It's for the hospital's own good, really. We can't have incompetence causing a scene." It took every ounce of Wesley's self-control not to recoil. He could still smell the expensive perfume she wore, the same scent from the night she'd whispered her venom to the waiter. He looked at this beautiful stranger, this woman he had once loved, and felt a profound, bottomless disgust. This was his role now, the one his father had prepared him for in the sterile conference room of the lawyer's Midtown office just hours earlier. The scene replayed in his mind. The long mahogany table, the binders filled with evidence, the grim-faced attorneys. He and Arthur had sat side by side, a united front, reviewing the final documents. They watched the CCTV footage on a laptop, a silent, damning film of Chloe's cruelty, her face contorted in a mask of rage. They had prepared for this moment. She will try to manipulate you, his father had said. Your job is to be a wall. Give her nothing. Wesley gently took Chloe's hands and removed them from his neck. The gesture was quiet, but it was a definitive rejection. Her sweetness vanished instantly, like a switch had been flipped. Her eyes narrowed. Fine. Be that way, she hissed, her voice dripping with spite. But you'll see. After tomorrow's board meeting, they'll all see my value. Your father can't run that place forever. It needs a modern touch. She gave him a look of pure condescension. It needs me. She turned back to the mirror, adjusting her dress, dismissing him completely. Wesley left her there, a queen surveying her kingdom of silk and cashmere, and retreated to the guest bedroom. He couldn't bear to sleep beside her. He lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, the silence of the massive apartment pressing in on him. He was an actor in the final, terrible act of a play he had co-written. Chloe, meanwhile, slept soundly. She dreamed of boardrooms and applause, of her name engraved on a new hospital wing. She woke feeling energized, powerful. She spent the morning on the phone, sketching out her vision for the new Pendleton Memorial. As she applied her lipstick, a final coat of crimson armor, she felt a surge of exhilaration. She was dressing for battle, a battle she was certain she had already won. She was about to step onto a stage she felt she deserved, ready to claim her prize. She walked out of the penthouse, leaving a trail of Chanel No. 5 inches the silent air, and took the elevator down to her waiting town car, completely, blissfully, and fatally unaware that she wasn't walking to a coronation. She was walking to an execution. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The boardroom at Pendleton Memorial was on the 30th floor, a sanctum of old money and quiet power. The walls were paneled in a dark, lustrous mahogany, and a single, immense table, polished to a mirror shine, dominated the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the East River. This was a room where fortunes were decided and dynasties were managed. To Chloe, it felt like coming home. She made her grand entrance at precisely 3 o'clock, nodding graciously to the board members already seated, a collection of New York's most powerful figures in finance, law, and real estate. She saw Wesley sitting on the far side of the table, his face pale and grim, and offered him a tight, proprietary smile. See, the smile said, this is where we belong. Her gaze swept the room, taking in her audience, ready to perform. And then she saw him. Sitting at the head of the table, in the chairman's seat, was a man she recognized. Her brain stuttered, refusing to process the image. It was the janitor, the old man from the lobby. He wasn't wearing his drab gray uniform. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored Savile Row suit of the deepest charcoal gray, a crisp white shirt, and a simple, elegant silk tie. He looked formidably, impossible. Chloe's confident smile faltered. A dizzying wave of confusion washed over her. She turned to Wesley, her eyes wide, her voice a low, contemptuous whisper meant only for him, yet it carried in the silent room. Wesley, what is this joke? Why is your father's janitor sitting at the head of the table? Is he here to serve coffee? This is highly unprofessional. Wesley didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He just stared at the polished surface of the table. The man at the head of the table showed no sign of having heard her. He calmly put on a pair of reading glasses, adjusted a stack of papers before him, and picked up a small wooden gavel. He rapped it once on the table. The sound was not loud, but it had the sharp, absolute finality of a cracking bone. The room fell into a profound silence. Good afternoon, Arthur Pendleton said, his voice the same calm, steady tone he'd used in the lobby. But in this room, it was imbued with an authority that was absolute. Thank you for attending this extraordinary meeting. I've called you here today to address a potential and significant threat to the reputation and financial stability of Pendleton Memorial Hospital. He looked down the length of the table, his gaze finally landing on Chloe. His eyes were not angry or vengeful. They were the dispassionate eyes of a surgeon about to make a necessary incision. The first item on the agenda is Mrs. Chloe Thorne. Chloe's heart gave a painful lurch. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Arthur nodded to a severe-looking man in a dark suit sitting to his right. Mr. Davies, you may begin. The hospital's chief counsel stood up. A large screen on the wall, previously hidden behind a mahogany panel, flickered to life. It did not show architectural renderings of a new charity wing. It showed a financial spreadsheet, a dense forest of numbers and dates. Mrs. Thorne, the lawyer began, his voice devoid of emotion, in your capacity as chairperson of the Pendleton Children's Cancer Fund, you have sole signatory authority over the charity's discretionary accounts. He used a laser pointer to highlight a series of transactions. Over the past 18 months, we have noted a pattern of withdrawals, 17 of them, to be precise, totaling $974,000, made out to a holding company, Vance Creative Solutions, LLC. Chloe stared at the screen, her mouth suddenly dry. Vance was her maiden name. Our investigation has found, Mr. Davies continued, clicking to the next slide, that Vance Creative Solutions, LLC, has no employees, no office, and has provided no services to the Children's Fund. It is, in fact, a shell corporation whose sole director is you. From there, the funds were transferred to your personal accounts. The room was utterly silent, save for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Chloe felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her, cold and assessing. The confidence she had walked in with evaporated, replaced by a frantic, clawing panic. That's a mistake, she stammered, her voice sounding thin and reedy. A clerical error. It was for consulting fees, for event planning. The lies felt clumsy and transparent even as she spoke them. She looked desperately toward Wesley, her last hope. Help me, her eyes pleaded. Fix this. But Wesley did not look at her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his expression a mask of pained resolve. In his refusal to meet her gaze, to offer her any protection, Chloe felt a terror she had never known. It was not the fear of losing money, or even of public shame. It was the primal, abyssal fear of being utterly and completely abandoned. Mr. Davies looked at Arthur, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Thank you, the lawyer said, turning back to Chloe. We will return to the matter of financial malfeasance shortly. But first, let's address the issue of conduct. If you'll all turn your attention to the screen. That's an outrageous lie, Chloe said, her voice rising, gaining a sharp defensive edge. She shot a venomous glare at the hospital's CFO, a man who had praised her fundraising efforts just weeks ago. My accountants handle all of that. If there are discrepancies, it's their incompetence, not my intent. This is a character assassination. She was grasping for a foothold, for any purchase on the slippery wall of her collapsing reality. The board members remained silent, their faces impassive, their silence a more damning judgment than any accusation. Arthur listened to her frantic denials without a flicker of expression. When she was finished, a desperate, panting silence filling the void, he looked back at Mr. Davies, the lawyer. There is another matter, Arthur said, his tone still perfectly level. A matter of character which has direct bearing on this institution's legal exposure and brand integrity. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. This behavior, committed against an employee on hospital grounds, in front of multiple witnesses, has exposed our organization to serious workplace abuse litigation and created a toxic work environment. This is an administrative issue, not a personal one. He gave another slight nod. Mr. Davies, please proceed with Exhibit B. The spreadsheet vanished from the screen. For a heart-stopping second, the screen was black. Then, an image flickered to life. It was a high-angle, full-color video taken from a security camera. The footage was silent at first. Chloe recognized the main lobby of the hospital. She saw herself, a furious figure in a white coat, storming across the marble floor. She saw the janitor, the bucket, the splash. And then the audio kicked in. The sound was crystal clear, the lobby's acoustics amplifying every shrill, ugly syllable. Her own voice, distorted by rage, filled the august boardroom. Look what you've done, you clumsy old man. These are Louboutins. Do you even know what that means? Chloe stared, mesmerized in horror. It was one thing to have lived the moment, fueled by her own righteous anger. It was another thing entirely to watch it replayed from a cold, objective distance, to see the contempt twisting her beautiful face into something grotesque. The camera's wide angle captured the reactions of the bystanders, the shocked nurse, the startled family, the people pulling out their phones. She was no longer the protagonist in her own drama. She was a specimen under a microscope, her cruelty laid bare for clinical observation. Wesley did not look at the screen. He couldn't. He looked only at Chloe. He saw the last vestiges of her defiance crumble, replaced by a dawning, sickening comprehension. He wasn't watching a villain get her comeuppance. He was watching the complete and utter disintegration of the woman he had married, and he felt nothing but a vast, empty sadness for the illusion he had loved for so long. On the screen, Arthur's calm voice provided a stark contrast. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. Let me get a cloth." Then came Chloe's sneering reply, echoing in the tomb-like silence of the room. "A cloth? No, that won't do." Her recorded voice dropped to its most venomous pitch, the final, unthinkable demand that sealed her fate. "You will get on your knees, and you will polish this stain off with your own hands, now, in front of everyone, so you learn your place." No one in the boardroom moved. No one spoke. Harrison Reed, a banking titan and an old friend of Arthur's, slowly took off his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose as if in pain. Dr. Annabelle Porter, the head of the ethics committee, turned her face away from the screen, unable to watch. Their silence was a verdict, more profound and absolute than any vote could be. The Chloe on screen watched with triumphant satisfaction as the old man, her father-in-law, the founder of the institution, began to lower himself to the floor. For a fleeting, terrible moment, watching the image of Arthur kneeling, the real Chloe felt something other than fear or anger. A hot, searing wave of shame washed over her, so intense it was physically painful. It was the last flicker of her humanity, the horrifying, belated realization of what she had done, of the person she had revealed herself to be. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed was heavy, leaden, and suffocating. It was broken only by a single ragged gasp. It came from Chloe. Her face, once a mask of confident beauty, had completely collapsed. Her mouth was slack, her eyes wide, with a terror that went beyond social or financial ruin. It was the terror of self-knowledge. She looked from the blank screen to the impassive faces of the board members, and finally to the man at the head of the table. Arthur said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her, his eyes holding no anger, no triumph, only a deep, cold, and irrevocable disappointment. And in that gaze, Chloe Thorne was erased. The black screen was a mirror reflecting the polished mahogany, the grim faces of the board, and the singular, shattered image of Chloe Thorne. The silence that rushed in to fill the void left by the video was not an absence of sound. It was a living entity, a physical pressure that seemed to suck the very air from the room. It was thick, with a unanimous, unspoken verdict. In that moment, every person in the room, from the billion-dollar hedge fund manager to the hospital's chief legal counsel, was a member of a jury that had already reached its decision. And in that profound, suffocating silence, every head, as if pulled by an invisible string, turned to Wesley. He was the final piece of the puzzle, the unknown variable in an equation that had otherwise been brutally solved. For years he had been an appendage to Chloe's ambition, a quiet, handsome, respectable partner who facilitated her ascent. Now he was the fulcrum on which the entire weight of this disaster rested. The dozen pairs of eyes on him were not just curious, they were demanding. They were asking a silent, fundamental question: who are you? He felt the crushing weight of their collective gaze. He could see two women simultaneously. One was the ghost from the video, a snarling, cruel stranger whose face was a grotesque parody of his wife's. The other was the woman he had loved, or thought he had loved, the radiant girl at a charity auction who had laughed with such easy charm, the ambitious partner who had pushed him to be more, the architect of their beautiful, glittering, hollow life. For a terrifying second, the ghost of that love, a powerful and persistent phantom, reached for him across the wreckage. It whispered of loyalty, of vows, of shared histories written in a language that only two people can ever truly understand. It was Chloe who acted first, sensing that flicker of hesitation, that last ember of the man she knew how to control. This was her final, desperate gambit, an all-or-nothing bet on the power she had always wielded over him. She pushed her chair back with a scrape that was jarring in the silence, her hands reaching across the mirror-like surface of the table, not in anger, but in a gesture of desperate, theatrical supplication. The carefully constructed mask of the powerful socialite dissolved completely, replaced by the raw, panicked face of a child about to be abandoned. Her tears were undeniably real, hot and thick, carving paths through the expensive foundation on her cheeks. Her voice, when she spoke, was a masterclass in calculated fragility, a trembling weapon aimed directly at his heart. "Wesley, darling, please, say something." Her fingers stretched toward him, trembling. "Please, tell them this is a misunderstanding. A terrible, awful misunderstanding. It's your father. He's always been jealous of us, of what we have. He's trying to tear us apart." Her voice broke on a sob, a sound she had perfected. She looked around the table, at the stone-faced jury, then back at him, her eyes locking onto his, trying to draw him back into their private world of two. "You love me, don't you?" she whispered, the question both a plea and a command. "Tell them. Tell them you love me. Tell them this isn't who I am." For the briefest of moments, Wesley felt the old instinct rise within him, the urge to protect, to soothe, to manage, to smooth over the cracks. But as he looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time without the filter of his own denial, he saw not just a desperate woman, but the intricate, ugly mechanics of her manipulation. The tears were real, but their purpose was strategic. The trembling voice was a performance. She was not asking for his love. She was demanding he use it as a shield to protect her from the consequences of her own character. And in that moment, the phantom died. He saw the image of his father, not the titan of industry in the Savile Row suit, but the quiet man in the gray uniform, his joints cracking as he lowered himself to a dirty floor in an act of silent, dignified protest. He owed that man a debt that could not be paid with silence or cowardice. Slowly, deliberately, as if moving through deep water, Wesley pushed his chair back. He rose to his full height. The movement was not aggressive. It was imbued with a sorrowful, irrevocable finality. Every eye was on him. He could feel the tension in the room tighten like a string on a violin. He did not look at Chloe. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if he looked at her pleading, tear-streaked face, some vestige of the man he used to be might falter. Instead, he drew a slow, deep breath, held it for a beat, and addressed the impassive faces of the board members. His voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear, steady, and carried the unshakable weight of a soul that had finally made its choice. "There is nothing I can say to defend what you have just seen," he began, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of his new self. "It is inexcusable." He paused, letting the simple, damning word hang in the air. He felt, rather than saw, Chloe flinch. "This institution," he continued, gesturing vaguely to the room, to the view of the city beyond, "was built by my father on a principle of service and dignity. For all people, the actions we have witnessed are a violation of that principle in its most fundamental form." He finally allowed himself to turn his head, not to meet Chloe's pleading eyes, but to look directly at the man at the head of the table. "I stand with my father, and I stand with this board." The final severance, the last, necessary cut, was all that remained. He turned his gaze back to the board at large, making his next statement a matter of public record, a corporate action required to staunch the bleeding and protect the legacy. "As of this moment," Wesley said, his voice as precise and cold as a surgeon's scalpel, "I consider my marriage to Mrs. Thorne to be over. My lawyers will be in contact with hers." A sound escaped Chloe's lips, a horrible guttural noise that was part sob, part gasp, the sound of a person's world imploding. She stared at him, her face a canvas of utter devastation, the final dawning realization that her greatest weapon, her husband's unwavering love, had just been used to deliver the killing blow. Arthur gave a subtle, almost imperceptible signal to the two uniformed security guards by the door. They moved forward with a quiet professionalism that was somehow more chilling than any force. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice gentle but firm, "if you'll come with us." There was no fight left. All the fire, the ambition, the fury, the magnificent, monstrous ego, it all collapsed inward, leaving a hollow, trembling shell. She sagged in her chair, allowing them to gently take her by the elbows and help her to her feet. Her body was racked with silent, convulsive sobs. She did not look at Wesley again as they escorted her from the room, a queen being led from her own execution. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, the sound echoing in the profound silence. Wesley remained standing, his hands gripping the back of his chair. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a vast, desolate landscape of grief. But beneath the sorrow, an unfamiliar sensation began to surface. The feeling of a colossal weight being lifted from his chest, the simple, forgotten freedom of being able to breathe. He slowly sank back into his chair, and, for the first time since this nightmare began, he met his father's eyes across the vast, empty expanse of the table. Arthur didn't smile. He simply held his son's gaze and gave a single, solemn nod. It was a silent, powerful exchange, an acknowledgement of shared pain, of a terrible price paid, and of a son who had, in the crucible of his own life's greatest failure, finally and fully come home. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe. Even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? 6 months later, the city had shed its summer skin. A crisp, unapologetic autumn had taken hold, painting the trees in Central Park with a palette of fiery gold and deep, bleeding crimson. The air, scrubbed clean by a recent rain, carried the scent of damp earth and the distant, sweet smell of roasted nuts from a street vendor's cart. It was the kind of morning that felt like a fresh start, a promise that the world could, in fact, begin again. Wesley walked beside his father along the gravel path circling the reservoir. In the months following the implosion in the boardroom, a new kind of silence had grown between them. The old silence had been one of avoidance, heavy with things left unsaid. This new silence was different. It was a comfortable, foundational quiet, the kind shared by two people who had weathered the same storm and found themselves, changed but intact, on the other side. The preliminary designs for the new pediatric wing came in, Wesley said, breaking the quiet. The architects have a proposal for a rooftop garden, a therapeutic space for the kids and their families. Arthur nodded, his gaze fixed on the placid gray water. Good. A hospital shouldn't just be a place to fix the body. It has to have a soul. People forget that. He paused, a small, wry smile touching his lips. You know, I spent a lot of time in the boiler room last year. Frank, the head of maintenance, he says the pipes in the old wing are starting to show their age. That's where the money needs to go first. Not the shiny new lobby art, the pipes, the foundations. Wesley felt a warmth spread through his chest. He finally understood his father's language. It wasn't just about plumbing, it was a philosophy. For years, Wesley had been captivated by the facade, by the glittering chandelier of the life he'd built with Chloe. He'd forgotten to check the foundations. The aftermath for Chloe had been a study in quiet, efficient demolition. There was no dramatic trial. The New York Post ran a single, viciously succinct story on page 6, complete with an unflattering photo of her leaving the Sullivan and Cromwell offices. The headline, "The Pendleton Purge," had become a fleeting catchphrase among the city's elite. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of embezzlement and the viral video that had become a case study in C-suite HR seminars on workplace abuse, Chloe had been utterly radioactive. The lawyers had been mercilessly professional. The morality clause in the prenup held firm, slicing away her claims to his future earnings and the Pendleton estate. The funds from the Children's Cancer Fund were repaid in full from her share of the sale of their assets, an act her lawyers framed as a voluntary restitution to correct a regrettable accounting error. The social fallout was absolute. Invitations stopped. Calls went unreturned. Her name was quietly removed from the glossy letterheads of a dozen charity committees. It was a social death, silent and complete. Wesley learned, through a stilted conversation with a former mutual friend, that Chloe had retreated to her mother's palatial estate in Palm Beach. He pictured her there, wandering through the sterile, air-conditioned rooms, a ghost in a paradise she had not earned, surrounded by a suffocating silence far more profound than the one in their old penthouse. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. There was only a deep, hollow ache for the years he had spent loving a beautifully crafted illusion. His own life had been rebuilt, piece by piece, on a new, more solid ground. The Park Avenue penthouse, with its panoramic views and painful memories, was sold. He now lived in a pre-war brownstone on the Upper West Side, a place with creaky floors, built-in bookshelves, and a small garden out back. It was a home, not a showroom. One rainy Tuesday, seeking refuge from the relentless demands of his schedule, he found himself in the hospital cafeteria. At a small table in the corner, a young woman with kind, intelligent eyes was studying a thick nursing textbook. It was Maria, the nurse from the check-in desk, the one whose quiet courage had been a small, steady light in the darkness of that awful day. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "Is this seat taken?" he asked. She looked up, a flash of recognition in her eyes, followed by a warm, unguarded smile. "Dr. Thorne, no, please." Their conversation was simple. He asked about her studies. She was in her final year. She asked with genuine concern how his father was doing. They talked about the relentless pressure of their jobs, the small victories, the shared sense of purpose that made the long hours bearable. There was no artifice, no agenda. It was just a conversation, a moment of simple human connection that felt more real to him than any of the 1,000 glittering parties he had attended with Chloe. It was not the beginning of a romance, not yet, but it was the beginning of a possibility. The possibility of a life built not on performance but on authenticity. Later that week, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, Wesley stood with his father on the sidewalk across from Pendleton Memorial. The lights were beginning to flicker on inside, transforming the monolith of glass and steel into a warm, glowing hive of activity. He could see the silhouettes of doctors and nurses moving behind the windows, the constant, rhythmic pulse of a place dedicated to holding back the night. "It looks the same," Wesley said quietly, more to himself than to his father. "But it feels different to me now." Arthur stood beside him, his hands tucked into the pockets of his old wool coat, a quiet figure against the grandeur of the institution he had willed into existence. He followed his son's gaze, a look of profound, paternal love on his face. "People see the name up there," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "They see the money, the prestige. They think that's the legacy. They're wrong." He turned and put a heavy, comforting hand on Wesley's shoulder. The weight of it was an anchor, a connection to a long line of quiet, decent men. "This building is made of steel and glass, son," Arthur said, his eyes meeting Wesley's, reflecting the golden lights of the hospital. "It's strong, but it can be broken. Our legacy, the real foundation, it's made of character. Never forget that." Wesley held his father's gaze. The guilt and the shame had finally washed away, leaving behind a hard-won clarity. He was a Thorne. He was a Pendleton. He was his father's son. And as he looked at the sprawling hospital, no longer just a work plaque,